So driving change really does mean changing the way that we look at things. And it all starts with each of us. Times of change really calls for great leaders and great leadership. And for our next discussion, we've brought together a fantastic and very diverse mix of leaders who are really looking at things differently and very committed to driving change. They're not afraid to try bold things, and they're not afraid to take risks for the future. So please welcome academic and writer Sinead Burke, Professor MacCraith, President of Dublin City University, Conor O'Leary of Greencore and representing our partners, the 30% Club, Louise Glennon of the National Women's Council of Ireland, Mary Carty, and our moderator, my good friend and colleague, Hilary O'Mara. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the welcome, Michelle. I'm a managing director in Accenture Ireland's local business, and I'm really very lucky in what I do. I get to work with some of the largest and the most successful organisations in this country. Many of these organisations are here with us this morning. You guys know who you are, can't see out there, and you're all very, very welcome. These companies typically call Accenture when they have something new, something difficult, something risky, something that's never been done before to do. And that's what really excites me about my job and motivates me. I'm joined this morning by a standout panel of 5 people. They're each pioneers in their own particular fields. But in meeting these people over the last few weeks, what struck me about these people was they are absolutely passionate about what they do, what they believe in. When they take action, other people follow. So, let me introduce the panel to you this morning. Starting from furthest away, Mary Carty, award-winning entrepreneur, co-founder of Outbox Incubator, and most recently executive for Blackstone LaunchPad NUI Galway. We've Sinead Burke, teacher, broadcaster, fashion blogger, and founder of Mini Melange. Hope I got that right. Conor O'Leary, company secretary Greencore, and member of the committee for the 30% Club. Louise Glennon, women in leadership coordinator for the National Women's Council of Ireland. And finally, Professor MacCraith, president of DCU. Thank you all for joining me this morning. You're all very welcome. We might just give them a quick round of applause. So, all of these people have done extraordinary and compelling things. They are truly trailblazers. I'm going to start my first question with Mary. You moved from a career in the arts to a career in technology. How did you make that change? What motivated you to make that decision to move?
I think it was curiosity was the big thing. My boyfriend at the time, now my husband, started a technology company, and like a lot of family businesses, I was helping out at weekends and evenings. And I absolutely loved how he was building community online with so many people all over the world. And it was thrilling to watch it. And I really wanted to be part of it. So an opportunity came up to become CEO of this company, and I jumped at it. And I haven't looked back since.
Brilliant. And so you're clearly passionate about science and technology, and you co-founded the first ever incubator for young women. Could you tell the audience just a little bit about that, because it's quite motivating?
Sure. It came to a certain point where I had to stop giving out that there was not enough women in technology. And moving from fine art into tech, it was all very much male-dominated. So last year, myself and my co-founder, Anne-Maria Maffedon, started Outbox Incubator. So the idea was to take young women, age 11 to 22, put them in a house in London for 6 weeks, and there they would meet the most incredible people from the industry and learn from each other and be mentored by the most incredible people. So last year we worked with 115 girls from 6 countries over 6 weeks, residential in a house in London. And we have a few Outbox girls in the audience today, and 2 are going to speak later on.
Brilliant, brilliant. Sinead, you have a fashion blog. How did you get into blogging? What prompted you to blog?
I was a teenager and I had this insatiable interest in fashion, and I never felt represented from going into my local boutique, whether that was Penny's or Brown Thomas, and not actually being able to reach anything, and then looking at the catwalks and looking in the magazines and never seeing anybody who looked like me. but actually even more so, never seeing anybody who looked different than that stereotype of what society deems as beautiful. And I suppose I could have really given up and found an interest in sport, but I didn't. And my way in was through information and education. I knew everything there was to know about the industry. I would sit around the dining room table at home and telling them, did you know that Burberry have invested all of their money in the Chinese market? And now that might not really pay off. And my family are really supportive, but it got to a point where they heard so much about fashion that they said, can you please stop and find a friend? Can you please find somebody that you can talk to about this? And I didn't find a friend, but I found the internet. And it gave me a voice to talk about a subject and a passion and an interest that stereotypically I really shouldn't have even been at the table for the conversation.
Brilliant. I think social media is actually a great equaliser. We might talk about that a little bit later. But Conor, you're the only man, or only until recently anyway, on the committee of the 30% Club. Could you tell us a little bit about the committee and how you got involved?
Yes, I guess if I had €1 for every time that someone asked me to tell why I'm on the 30% Club, I probably could retire by now. I can never understand why I'm asked so often, because I don't see representation of females as a female issue. I see it as a human issue. You know, I just don't. But anyway, I guess just to put it in perspective, the 30% Club is a voluntary group of businesses coming together, originally founded in 2010 in the UK, when there was a recognition that essentially there was very few chief executives of major organisations, particularly in the FTSE 100, at both chief executive and on non-executive level. Greencore, the company that I'm company secretary for, is now listed on the FTSE, so I suppose I would have been aware of the 30% Club in the UK and the work that they were doing to try and drive female representation at the senior level and to effectively work on a pipeline to get there. I mean, there is no magic bullet in any of this. So there was a chapter of the 30% Club started in Ireland. A group of really, really determined individuals, all female, started in 2014. There was an official launch in 2015, and Greencore was one of the drivers of the original one, and I just became on board at that point. But I am delighted to say that after 1 year, I have finally got another man on board.
Yes, I heard that, yeah.
And he's far better than I am, Peter Cosgrove of CPL. But I think, you know, that demonstrates that I think women need to also listen, and, you know, men are part of the problem, and we accept that.
And can I ask you, how do men react when you tell them that you're part of the 30%?
Well, they all want to know what's in it for me. Is there some sort of backhander, or is there what is the motivation? But as most of your speakers have said already, behind me is my mother, who she was one of those that had to give up her job in the civil service. She was very driven. We had a family business, and, you know, there was no such thing as a weak female role model in my life.
That is definitely a theme this morning.
Yeah.
So Louise, you also had a fairly radical career change, or career journey. Could you just tell us a little bit about the events that led to you join the National Women's Council of Ireland?
Yeah, well, I was in college during the boom years, so, you know, the sky was the only limit for me. You know, I thought the only way was up. But one of my first jobs out of college, unfortunately, Lehman Brothers collapsed in September, and I was out on my ear just a month later, and I was devastated. I couldn't believe it. You know, I'd never really heard of anybody that was losing their job during that time. So I started writing letters to people who I thought could help me get a job. And one of the people that I wrote to was a businessman and, coincidentally, although I didn't know it at the time, a philanthropist. And I started working for his charity on the day of the launch. Haven. So I hung up coats and made tea, and I left there 3 years later, having been over and back to Haiti with hundreds and thousands now of volunteers to build houses out there. And really, while working for Haven, I learned that equality wasn't an accident. You know, and a lot of the damage that was done in Port-au-Prince was as a result of a lot of bad policy and bad decision making. Yes, there was a natural disaster, but the knock-on effects were as a result of decision making. So it was through Haven that I got a passion for equality. I then went on to Amnesty, and then to the National Women's Council, where the focus now is on gender equality and, you know, diversity in decision making.
Very good, very good. Brian, I'll come to you next. Like Conor, you're very passionate about supporting women. That's great, and you're definitely leading the way in DCU with your Women in Leadership programme. You know, what compelled you to sponsor that programme?
Well, I suppose as a physicist, I'm data-driven, and what hit me first of all with taking over the university was looking at the data in terms of the gender imbalance. And if I take you just through the 4 major levels, at lectureship level, which is the entry level, it's 1-to-1 male-female, which you'd expect. At senior lecturer level, it's 2-to-1. At associate professor level, it's 3-to-1 in favour of males. And at senior professor level, it's 5-to-1. Just unacceptable. And we're not the worst, by the way, just to be clear, but unacceptable. So what compelled me was, I said, 2 aspects of that. One is the lack of equity in it, the lack of fairness, and secondly, the unbelievable waste of talent. So part of any organisation, it's about talent management, talent development, and clearly 50% of the talent available to the university was not getting the fair crack of the whip. Started to analyse it, of course, and realised that it's a multifaceted issue. It's not just one thing. So early last year, I worked with our director of HR, Marion Burns, and I said, look, we're going to examine this issue and set in place a whole range of initiatives to tackle it. So we launched the DCU Women in Leadership Initiative with a range of initiatives, unconscious bias for all people, training for all people on interviews, mentoring, leadership development. But if I can tell one thing that really influenced me. A few weeks before the launch, we were launching something else, a major fundraising initiative for the university called Shaping the Future. And I invited a futurologist, male, to speak. We had an MC, male, Sean Whelan, for RTE. I was speaking at it, the chair of our fundraising board was speaking at it. And at the end of it, in front of a big audience like this, we got up and people said, will we take a photograph? And I knew straight away, 4 men in suits in front of nearly 1,000 people. It was wrong. Within a few minutes, the emails started coming to me from female staff, justifiably. And I decided I'd meet each one of those and speak with them. And what it really affected me in terms of, it was much more than just the all-male panel. It was about the culture in the institution itself. So we've initiated something, a new initiative called Listening Lunches, where I meet with 8 to 10 female staff every month, and I listen to them and simply ask them one question: what's it like to be a female in this university? And it has a major impact on me in terms of initiatives that I can implement now, because ultimately culture eats strategy for breakfast. And it's about changing the culture, and it's about making the organisation more inclusive, while at the same time tackling the quantitative measures.
I think it's very commendable that you're listening to women. I think it's something we do in Accenture as well, and it's mind-blowing sometimes when you hear what they tell you. It's just the simple things that make the difference. But this morning we've heard reference to 100 years of history, and our opening was jaw-dropping really. Some would say we've come a long way since then, since 1916, and others clearly we're not progressing fast enough. Louise, where do you stand on this? We were talking about this earlier. What's your view? Are we moving fast enough?
We're not progressing fast enough, in my view, no. I'm 32 years of age. I'm kind of growing up in this digital area where we expect things to happen quickly. I know, we've come from the marriage bar, so we're starting at quite a low base. But when you think that yesterday the National Women's Council held an event to celebrate historical numbers of women joining the Dáil, it's now there's 35 women that have joined the Dáil as a result of the last election, which brings us up to 22.2%. I can't believe we're celebrating 22%. An official minority is 30% or less. So women are still a minority, but yet that's something that we feel we need to celebrate, because there are 10 more women that have joined the Dáil, and it's a 40% increase.
So we've clearly got more we need to do.
Loads more.
I suppose we come here every year and we're talking, but Mary, are women talking too much to themselves? That's something that sometimes frustrates me. We all get together and we're talking to each other. Brian talks about him, he's listening to the women. Do we need to get men more involved in the conversation? And how do we even go about doing that?
I think so, and I think that there are a lot of men who are very willing, just like our fantastic panellists here, to help. And maybe we need to ask for more help and have conversations that are inclusive and invite people in, because this is a conversation that all of us need to share and develop. And we need to invite older and younger people in, and people from cross sectors, because all of us have to solve this problem together, because society as a whole will be better, and our sons and our daughters will have a much better future if we're more inclusive. So we need to find ways to have conversations with everyone, and in ways that are welcoming and inclusive, and to listen really carefully to what people say.
Very good.
Could I just
yeah.
say, just on that, McKinsey, the consultants did a study a couple of years ago, and they asked in the universities, they took 50-50 men and women and asked if you all have the same qualifications leaving college, do you believe that you all have the exact same prospects of being chief executive, number one? And 93% of men said yes. Clearly it was a much lower women figure. So the acknowledgement is not there from the male side of the significance of the issue. I mean, I would tell people, for example, that in Ireland, only 6% of our PLCs have a chief executive who's female. We can name them. You know, it's got to the stage where Siobhan Talbot becomes chief executive of Glanbia, and we can name a woman, and it's like, oh, Conor, you can hang your hat on that one. It's the most bizarre conversation that you actually can have. So unless you engage with men, it's
And do you think they
never
want
going
to get
change.
involved? Do you think men want to get involved? Obviously, clear yourself.
I think men are not, and it's not running my own sex down, but we're not aware. It's not that we're trying to, I don't think I've never met anyone actually who believes that these statistics are wrong. I've never believed anyone who's questioned them.
the research,
but none of them believe that there's a problem. I think it's a growing awareness now. But I think there's a huge amount of work needs to be done. You know, there's statistics after statistics. If you're in the US, it's a lower figure. There's more chief executives called John in the US than there are females. You could go on. It's scary.
So getting men involved is clearly one action we need to take. But there's other actions we can take as well. Sinead, having mentors has been very important and very much part of your success. Do you think women having mentors, you know, helps them to reach their full potential?
It's absolutely huge. You know, as you mentioned there very kindly, I do have a fashion blog, but it's evolved now into some sort of kind of a long read publication, and that was stemmed from the media's attitudes to women. It was an article I read in the New York Times 2 years ago that said Mick Jagger's girlfriend has died. And I remember being horrified. The woman in question, her name was Loren Scott, an infamous fashion designer, but even if she wasn't in the public eye, she was a person and deserved to be acknowledged even in death. And again, I went back to my family giving out about this, and they said, if you're so annoyed, do something about it. So I did. So I emailed all of these women who I really admired, didn't know from Adam, said, hello, you don't know who I am, but I think you're great. Could we meet and sit down and have a cup of coffee, free of sensationalism? I'm not going to ask about your children. I'm not going to ask how you manage a work-life balance. But what I would love to know is, how did you get to where you are? Are you resilient? What are the traits and characteristics? And write them up. And I have been so grateful and fortunate and lucky that those women have said yes to me. And that has been my success. And I think we can do things in very small ways to accelerate the movement, as Louise said. Like if somebody is emigrating to London and you know 3 Irish people who live there, tag them in an email and introduce them to go for a cup of coffee. Sometimes the monumental things like events like these are really powerful, but sometimes the simplicity of introducing somebody can have huge impact and a huge ripple effect on their career and their personality. And I think it's really important to value those small tasks as much as we do the big ones.
Definitely. You talked about doing small things, and it's not maybe small, but it was subtle. Mary, you had a very interesting approach to attracting women to what would be typically considered male-dominated roles. Could you just share that story? Because I just thought it was really interesting when you shared it earlier.
I had a really interesting experience recently where one of our students started a program called Stock School. And I know from research and working with women and my own business that a lot of women don't get a lot of education around their financial future. But this particular student started Stock School, and 50-50 men and women come to his class. So on my first day in the job, I asked him to show me the text that he used to introduce Stock School to the students. So it's a student teaching other students. And nowhere in that paragraph was he or she mentioned. So words are really important, you know, how we invite people in, the language that we use, the spaces that we develop, how we describe what we do. That's really important. And this young student cracked it. And in every single night, his class is full, male and female. And I met a young student yesterday who wants to be an investor. She's in first year, and she's in his class.
I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, clearly the language we use is really important. I know, Conor, would you agree with that? Do you think that we, when we're going to work every day, men and women, understand and appreciate that our language and our behaviour actually has an impact on the people we're working with?
I think Michelle touched on it earlier on. When you Google words such as leaders, chief executives, bossy, they all give you a very different image in your head. And again, it goes back to something that was spoken about earlier, which is, teaching children from an early age. Diversity should be embraced. No one is suggesting that men and women should be the same. I mean, all the statistics will show from a business perspective, and that's what I focus on, that the more diversity you have on a board, the better it does. If you have, 8 pale, male and stale men sitting there, in the evening they're going to talk about football, they're going to talk about the Arsenal back four, they're going to talk about Donegal versus Kerry. That's what they'll talk about. If you can get an extra minority, call it a minority of 30% of females, you'll find that dynamic completely changes, and there's much more of a work ethos, because that's what they have in common. And it's the language that's driven from these conversations is key. And that's
great.
where the benefit
so
comes
we've
from.
talked about getting men involved, we've talked about the use of language, we've talked about mentoring. Brian, just in all the work you're doing in DCU, is there any other actions we should be taking? Is there a silver bullet out there to help us to narrow the gender gap?
I think there's no silver bullet, but I think it's recognising that it is a complex issue and there are many dimensions to it. But one of the ones that I keep seeing again and again is the confidence issue, and it's the imposter syndrome, which is, I think, well recognised. And we had the pleasure of awarding an honorary doctorate to Jocelyn Bell Burnell last year. Many of you would know she was the person, I suppose, an iconic person who's a great symbol for women in STEM, but also many feel should have received the Nobel Prize, but didn't, and people relate that to gender. But she spoke to her students, and they were hugely impacted by this, female students, a bit this notion of building that confidence and not feeling out of place itself. And certainly we see it in terms of women putting themselves forward for opportunities, and it's ensuring that people get mentoring as part of it, but also role models. One thing I noticed as well, we run this Nobel laureate lecture series, and if you go back to 1901 when this was started, 874 Nobel Prizes have been awarded, 45 of those to females. So there's only about 18 living female Nobel Prizes in the world. So this whole notion of role models, I think, is a hugely significant issue. We've looked at one US college where they've actually shifted the percentage of women in computer science courses from 10% 5 years ago to over 45% now. But the language was part of that, as you've heard earlier on. The supportive environment, but role models made a huge difference. I think that's a key issue. Leaders, women role models, and that's why events like today are so critically important.
So your stats are a little bit depressing there, so we clearly need to do something a bit more radical. We need to get some inspiration from 1916. Louise, you did something fairly radical at an event that you were organising in Croke Park. Could you share that story with us?
Yeah, I had the pleasure of working with about 35 young women last year, and we had an event called FemFest in December, which was the culmination of a number of workshops. And we visited a number of different venue spaces, potential for holding FemFest. We had a crowd of about 150 young women coming, and we went to Croke Park, and we saw this beautiful space, really high ceilings, probably triple height, and lining the main room was 3 massive pillars. I'd say they were about 9, I don't know how tall, but on each of those pillars on either side there was a picture of one of the GAA heroes, all male. They were about 7 foot tall. I was eye-line with their hips, and I'm a tall woman. And we went through the venue. We decided we wanted the space, but at the very end I said, there's just one more thing. And the woman that was guiding us through, the event manager, said, oh, don't worry, hit me. I'm sure I've heard it all before. And I was like, I have a feeling you haven't. And I said, can we take the men down? And she said, which men? And I was like, him. And is it possible to replace them with women? No, it wasn't possible to replace them with women, despite the fact that the day I visited Croke Park was the day after the Cork women had won their 10th final out of 11 years in a row, one of the most celebrated teams in GAA history, but there wasn't one woman on a wall. So we got the men removed, but we didn't get any women up. But that was because of role models, because we couldn't have women walking into that space and only seeing giant men on the walls.
It was a small thing to do, but it's back to language, it's back to environment. All of these things, if we're just aware of it, we can actually make a difference.
Yeah.
So we're close to having to wrap up, but just before I go, I would like to ask one very important question. So as a generation who are around in 2016, what do we collectively want to be known for when we talk about, narrowing the gender gap? If I could ask you all just to give me one thing you think we should do, and I might start with you, Mary.
Take an action. Doing something really positive. Stop complaining. Do something. even small things like introducing someone, open a door, open a window, do something, support and help out.
Very good, Sinead.
I think we need to have an active conversation in relation to the word equality. We've had an amazing year since the referendum last year. Though we didn't vote yes to electing a younger president, and I would question the equality of that. But I think we need to look at those things. And even when we have an all-female panel, I think that's excellent and brilliant. But where is the representation of race, of religious belief, of disability? And I think we need to look at the intersectionality and the real equality of our issues. And we need to do something about it. We need to do small actions and large actions. And I think we need to question things further and have active conversations with men and women at the table.
Very good, Conor.
For me, I think it's about, there's such a talent pool out there that's untapped in business. We all accept that. And we need to create an environment and a pipeline to get these people. I mean, historically, if I go into any businesses to give a talk on gender equality, I'm met by the HR director who's female, I'm met then by the marketing director who's female, and then I go up to the top level and I meet the male chief executive who's 6'4" and called John. Like, we need to address, I know this before I even get to reception. So I think what we need to do, you know, and within the 30% Club, we have it's a forum where we all share, we share ideas, we share best practice. So Dell, for example, have a fantastic program called Mark, which is about bringing men, educating men, for want of a better expression. They have a much nicer way of packaging it. But that type of thing, and unconscious bias, we give lectures, we give help, you know, simple things like in an interview process, make sure there's a female on the panel. Just very simple things which will give a woman the opportunity to actually come into an organisation. You know, we had Noreen in earlier, Garda Commissioner. You know, the minister is also a male. A new guard comes in, stands up and sees all the bosses and says, you know what, I can achieve something here. And I think until we can develop role models and get the pipeline running, which obviously the 30% Club is all about, I think that's the silver bullet, but you need a very big gun for it.
Very good, Louise.
I've got two things very briefly. I suppose language is so important, and the language of the Constitution, I think, is really important, and women's role in the home is still protected, which I find absolutely just mind-boggling. I'd like to remove that and to repeal the 8th Amendment as well. But also, you know, as with Conor, the pipeline is incredibly important. We would be, you know, looking at the shop floor to the boardroom table, and the measures that you need to have right throughout that pipeline. But we would say that it needs to be quota-driven, just like the last election. We've seen those really, really dramatic results, albeit they still, you know, there's still more change to happen, but we would see the quota as being essential at boardroom level as well. Okay, and Brian?
Hilary, can I do like Louise and give you two answers? One general and one specific.
Yes, I think we're okay.
The general one is that this is about, I think, the 5th panel, public panel in 2 years I've sat on and spoken and discussed the problem and talked about potential solutions. I think we should avoid Groundhog Day, that this next year isn't like this year, and I'm a great believer in setting targets. I think Women for Election showed what could be done in the political sphere. Today is a United Nations International Women's Day, and they're using the terminology UN Planet 50-50 by 2030. And we should set targets and measure ourselves as a nation, as a society, in terms of trying to achieve real progress, and know if we're doing well or doing poorly. So that's the general. The more specific one is something I'm very passionate about, is in STEM careers. And it's been a real slog for years and very little change. But I think there's a real opportunity in the whole computer science coding space. And Ireland has taken a great leap forward in that in terms of Coder Dojo, coolest projects. And you have two amazing young women going to be on stage shortly, Katrina and Niamh, who've come through that. And we're seeing the figures coming through that space that are much closer to the 50-50. The coolest projects, for example, will have something like 35 to 40% projects coming from young females. And I think, given the nature of a knowledge society, a digital society, coding is going to play such a huge part. I think if as a nation we can set a target to bring that fully into schools and make the language correct, make the applications correct, so that we actually hit that 50-50 target sooner rather than later.
Very good. Very inspiring, everything that you've said there. And I just hope that all of us here in the audience today can just help, you know, make some of this happen. I'd really like to thank you all for joining us this morning. It was really excellent. There's certainly loads to reflect on and loads to act on, very importantly. So, Gurmia Market.